The transport ship groaned through Pacific waters like a dying whale, its hull scraping against waves that had turned from sapphire to slate. In the cargo hold below deck, Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his palm against the cold metal wall and felt the vibration of the engine's travel through his bones. 23 days at sea. 23 days since the surrender at Okinawa. 23 days of wondering if the stories were true, if Americans really did execute prisoners, if the rage over Pearl Harbor still burned hot enough to turn mercy into ash. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The air in the hold was thick with bodies and breath. 214 men packed into a space meant for military equipment. Some slept curled against each other for warmth. Others sat with their backs against the walls, eyes open but seeing nothing, lost in memories of cherry blossoms and letters from mothers they would never receive. Takeshi had stopped counting the days after the first week. Time had become liquid here, pooling in strange places, evaporating when you needed it most. "Yamamoto-san," whispered a voice beside him. It was Hiro Nakamura, barely 19, with a face still soft enough to show he'd been conscripted straight from university. The boy's hands trembled constantly now, ever since the shelling that had buried him alive for 6 hours before his unit dug him out. "Do you think they'll separate us? My brother was captured at Guadalcanal. I heard nothing after that. Nothing for 2 years. Takeshi looked at the boy. No, he had to stop thinking of him as a boy. They were all soldiers here, all warriors who had failed their emperor, all men who had chosen life over honor. The shame of it sat in his chest like a stone. "I don't know what they'll do," Takeshi said finally. "But we're alive. That has to mean something." "Does it?" Hiro's voice cracked. "My father would rather I had died. The last letter I received before the invasion, he wrote that death in service was the highest calling. He sent me a photograph of our family shrine. He was telling me where my spirit should return." Takeshi had received a similar letter. Most of them had. The concept of surrender didn't exist in the vocabulary they'd been raised with. To be captured was to become something less than human, a ghost walking in a world that no longer recognized your existence. And yet here they were, breathing, thinking, hoping despite everything they'd been taught. A sudden lurch of the ship sent men sliding across the floor. Someone cried out. The engines changed pitch, slowing, and then Takeshi heard it. The sound that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Voices from above. American voices, shouting orders in that harsh, angular language that still sounded like gravel in a tin can to his ears. "We're here," someone said in the darkness. "We've arrived." The words rippled through the hold like wind through wheat. Men who had been sleeping jerked awake. Those who had been silent began to murmur prayers. Takeshi closed his eyes and thought of his wife, Yuki. Their last night together, she had worn her best kimono, the blue one with white cranes in flight. She had served him tea with hands that didn't shake, had smiled with lips that didn't tremble, had told him she would wait however long it took. He wondered if she was still waiting. He wondered if she even knew he was alive. The metal door at the top of the stairs screeched open, and light poured in like liquid gold, so bright after weeks of dimness that men covered their faces and turned away. American soldiers descended the stairs, rifles held ready but pointed at the floor. Their uniforms were clean. Their faces were young. Some of them looked nervous. "All right, listen up," shouted an officer with silver bars on his collar. A Japanese-American translator stood beside him, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked uncomfortable in his American uniform. "You will exit the ship in single file. You will keep your hands visible at all times. Any sudden movements will be met with force. Do you understand?" The translator repeated the words in Japanese, his accent strange, a mixture of Tokyo formality and something else, something that suggested years away from home. The prisoners mumbled their understanding. What choice did they have? They climbed the stairs slowly, men and used to walking after weeks of sitting and lying down. Takeshi's legs shook with each step. His eyes watered in the brightness. And then he reached the deck, took 3 more steps, and stopped so suddenly that Hiro bumped into him from behind. The sight before him was impossible. The harbor was enormous, larger than any port Takeshi had ever seen. Ships of every size crowded the water, military vessels painted gray, cargo ships stacked with containers, fishing boats bobbing near the docks. But it was beyond the harbor that made his breath catch. Buildings. Hundreds of buildings, thousands of buildings, rising from the earth like a forest of steel and glass and concrete. Some were so tall they seemed to pierce the clouds. The sunlight reflected off their windows in blinding cascades of light. "What is this place?" Hiro whispered. "San Francisco," said the translator, who had moved close enough to hear. "Welcome to America, gentlemen. I hope you're prepared for what you're about to see." Takeshi barely heard him. He was staring at the city, at the cars moving along distant streets like toys, at the bridges spanning the bay in impossible arcs of engineering, at the sheer scale of everything. In 28 years of life, Takeshi had never imagined anything like this existed. Tokyo had been magnificent before the firebombing, certainly, but this was something else entirely. This was a city that had never known war on its soil, never felt bombs rain from the sky, never watched its children starve in the streets. This was the enemy, and it was more powerful than anything they had been told. The prisoners were herded off the ship and onto trucks with canvas covers. Takeshi found himself pressed between Hiro and an older man named Kenji Sato, a former sergeant who had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite in the mountains of China. Kenji's face was weathered and scarred, and he rarely spoke, but now he leaned close to Takeshi and whispered, "They did not tell us the truth about any of it." The truck's engine rumbled to life, and they began to move. Through gaps in the canvas, Takeshi caught glimpses of American life. A woman walking a dog, the animal well-fed and wearing a collar. Children playing on a sidewalk, their laughter high and bright. A man watering his lawn, the grass green and trimmed. Shops with windows full of goods, food, clothing, furniture. Things that seemed impossible in a world where Takeshi's own nation had been starving, where every resource had been poured into the war machine. "Look," Hiro said, pointing. "That store. It's full of everything." A grocery store passed by, its windows displaying pyramids of fruit, crates of vegetables, shelves lined with canned goods. An older prisoner near the front of the truck began to weep silently. Takeshi understood. They had been told America was weak, decadent, soft. They had been told the war was necessary to save Asia from Western colonialism, to create a sphere of prosperity. They had been told so many things, and every single one of them had been a lie. The truck turned onto a highway, and the speed increased. Through the gap in the canvas, Takeshi watched the city give way to rolling hills dotted with houses, each one with its own plot of land, its own car parked outside. The abundance was staggering, overwhelming, painful. "Yamamoto-san," Hiro said quietly, "what will happen to us now?" Takeshi thought about the question. He thought about the Geneva Convention documents the Americans had shown them, about the promises of fair treatment, about the uncertainty that stretched ahead like an uncharted ocean. He thought about Yuki waiting in a Tokyo that might not exist anymore. He thought about the emperor's voice on the radio, tinny and distant, speaking words that meant surrender without ever saying the word. "I don't know," Takeshi said finally, honestly, "but I think we're going to learn what it means to be defeated by a nation we never truly understood." The truck drove on through the California afternoon, carrying its cargo of broken soldiers toward a destination unknown, toward a future written in a language they had yet to learn, toward the most unusual sight any of them would ever witness. The face of an enemy that refused to match the image they'd been given. Camp McClellan sprawled across 100 acres of California desert, a temporary city of barracks and guard towers and barbed wire that stretched toward mountains hazy with heat. Takeshi stood in the processing line with 200 other men, each waiting to be photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number that would replace their names in all official documentation. The sun beat down with an intensity that reminded him of summers in Hiroshima, but the air here was different, dry and clean, without the humidity that had made every breath in the Pacific Islands feel like drowning. "Prisoner 47283, said the American clerk, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and sweat stains under his arms. The translator, the same Japanese American from the ship, repeated the number in their language. You'll be assigned to Barracks 7, Section C. You'll receive 2 blankets, 1 pillow, eating utensils, and a hygiene kit. Male privileges will be explained during orientation. Any questions? Takeshi shook his head. What question could he ask that would matter? The clerk stamped a form, handed him a manila envelope, and gestured toward the next station. The bureaucracy of captivity was surprisingly similar to the bureaucracy of military service. Forms and numbers and lines, the reduction of human beings to data points that could be filed and forgotten. Barracks 7 was a long wooden structure with rows of bunk beds, each made up with surprising care. The blankets were thick and clean. The mattresses, though thin, were actual mattresses, not the bare boards Takeshi had slept on during training. Small windows lined the walls, and at the far end, a wood-burning stove sat cold and ready for winter. It was better than many of the accommodations he'd had in the Imperial Army. Hiro claimed the bunk above Takeshi's, and Kenji Sato took the one across the narrow aisle. Other men filled in around them, some quiet and shell-shocked, others already forming small groups based on which unit they'd served in, which island they'd been captured on. Takeshi recognized the need for connection, for the illusion of belonging to something larger than their individual shame, but he found himself reluctant to join in. He wanted to disappear into routine, to let the days pass without notice until the strange limbo resolved into something he could understand. Attention! The shout came from the doorway. An American officer entered, followed by 2 guards and the translator. The prisoners stood by their bunks, uncertain whether to bow or salute or simply wait. The officer was young, maybe 30, with red hair and freckles and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison," he said through the translator. "I'm the officer in charge of this section. Let me make a few things clear. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and humanely. You will not be tortured or executed. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. In return, you will obey all camp rules, respect the authority of American personnel, and conduct yourselves with discipline. Any violations will result in consequences. Any questions?" An older prisoner near the front raised his hand slowly. "Sir, will we be allowed to send letters to our families?" The translator relayed the question. Morrison nodded. "Yes, once a month you'll be permitted to write 1 letter. It will be censored for military information, but personal messages will be allowed. Mail service to Japan is currently disrupted, but we're working on establishing channels through neutral countries. Another hand. What about work? Will we be forced to labor?" Morrison's expression shifted slightly. "You'll be given the opportunity to work if you choose. Not forced. We have agricultural projects, maintenance work, and light manufacturing. Those who work will receive a small wage that can be used at the camp canteen. The work is voluntary." Voluntary. The word hung in the air like something exotic. In the Imperial Army, nothing had been voluntary. You obeyed or you were beaten. You fought or you were shot. The concept of choice, even in captivity, was almost incomprehensible. After Morrison left, the barracks erupted in conversation. Some men were skeptical, certain this was propaganda designed to make them compliant. Others were cautiously hopeful, wondering if perhaps the stories of American brutality had been exaggerated. Takeshi lay on his bunk and stared at the wooden slats above him, where Hiro was already snoring softly, exhausted by the day's events. He thought about Yuki again. Did she know he was alive? The last time he'd been able to send a letter was 6 months ago, from a postal station on Saipan before the American invasion. He'd written carefully, avoiding anything that might suggest doubt or fear, filling the page with reassurances he didn't feel and promises he couldn't keep. "I am well. I am serving with honor. I will return to you. All lies in the end." The truth was that he'd been terrified every single day. Terrified of dying, yes, but more terrified of failing, of proving himself weak, of being the one who broke when others held firm. And when the moment came, when the choice was surrender or a futile death, he had chosen life. He had dropped his rifle and raised his hands and spoken the words in broken English. "I give up. No more fight. Was Yuki ashamed of him? Did his family know? His father, a proud man who had served in the Russo-Japanese War, who kept his medals in a glass case and told stories of victory, would he be able to look at his son again? Or had Takeshi's name already been removed from the family register, his existence erased like a mistake in calligraphy? Yamamoto-san. Hiro's voice came from above, soft and hesitant. Are you awake? Yes. I keep thinking about what the lieutenant said, about letters. Do you think our families will want to hear from us? Takeshi had wondered the same thing. I don't know, but I think we have to try. Even if they don't respond, even if the letters never arrive, we have to try. A long silence. Then, my brother was studying medicine before the war. He was going to be a doctor. He was so smart, Yamamoto-san. So much smarter than me. When he was conscripted, my mother wept for 3 days. And then when we heard he'd been captured, she stopped weeping altogether. She just stopped talking about him, stopped saying his name, as if he'd never existed. Maybe, Takeshi said carefully, maybe in time she'll understand. Maybe when the war is truly over, when the smoke clears, people will see things differently. Do you believe that? I have to. The days that followed established a rhythm that was strange in its ordinariness. Wake at 6 to a bugle call. Roll call in the yard, where they stood in rows while guards counted and recounted, making marks on clipboards. Breakfast in the mess hall, oatmeal or rice porridge, bread with margarine, weak coffee that was somehow better than anything Takeshi had tasted in the last 2 years of war. Then the day stretched out with surprising emptiness. Some prisoners signed up for work details immediately. Kenji Sato was among them, choosing a spot on the agricultural crew that tended the vegetable gardens on the camp's eastern edge. Idle hands make troubled minds, he said simply when Takeshi asked why. Others spent their days in the recreation yard, where the Americans had provided sports equipment, baseballs, basketballs, even a volleyball net. Takeshi watched them play with a kind of detached fascination. How strange to see men who had killed and nearly been killed now throwing a ball back and forth, laughing when someone missed, arguing playfully over rules. He chose instead to spend his time in the camp library, a small building near the administrative offices that contained books in multiple languages. Most were in English, useless to him, but there were also volumes in Japanese, novels, poetry collections, even a few textbooks. Takeshi discovered a copy of The Tale of Genji and lost himself in its ancient intrigues, its courtly romances, its world so different from his own that it might as well have been another planet. You read a lot, said a voice one afternoon. Takeshi looked up to find a Japanese-American man standing by his table. Not the translator, but someone else. Someone older with gray at his temples and gentle eyes. He wore civilian clothes, a simple shirt and trousers. I'm Daniel Nakano. I'm with the War Relocation Authority. I help coordinate educational programs for the camps. Yamamoto Takeshi, he replied, unsure whether to bow or offer his hand. He compromised with a slight nod. Nakano sat down without asking permission, a casual American gesture that still felt slightly rude to Takeshi's Japanese sensibilities. I see you're reading Murasaki Shikibu. Beautiful work. I read it in college, though I must admit I struggled with the classical Japanese. My parents spoke mostly English at home. You're Japanese but not Japanese, Takeshi said, then immediately regretted the bluntness. But Nakano only smiled sadly. That's one way to put it. I was born in California. My grandparents came from Hiroshima in 1891. I've never been to Japan, though I grew up hearing stories about it. And now, he gestured vaguely at the camp around them. Now I'm something in between. Too American for Japan, too Japanese for America. Where were you during the war? Takeshi asked. In a camp. Nakano's voice was flat. Not this kind. A relocation camp. For American citizens of Japanese descent. Manzanar. They took us from our homes in Los Angeles and put us behind barbed wire because they thought we might be disloyal. My father, who served in the American Army during the First World War. My mother, who had never traveled more than 50 miles from the house where she was born. My little sisters, who couldn't speak a word of Japanese. All of us, locked up. Takeshi set down his book. I don't understand. You're American citizens. We were. We are. It doesn't seem to matter much. Nakano pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Takeshi, who declined. After Pearl Harbor, the government decided we were a threat. Executive Order 9066. Incarceration without trial, without charges, without any evidence of wrongdoing. We lost our home, our business, everything. And the irony, the painful, bitter irony, is that I understand why you fought. I understand what it means to be told your loyalty is questioned, to be treated as an enemy by the country you love. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, someone shouted in triumph. A goal scored in the soccer game. Life continuing despite everything. Why are you here? Takeshi asked finally. Because I speak the language. Because I understand both sides, or at least I try to. Because someone needs to help bridge the gap. Nakano exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. And maybe because I need to understand it myself. This war. What it meant. What it took from all of us. Over the following weeks, Takeshi found himself spending more time talking with Nakano. The man seemed genuinely interested in the prisoners' stories, not as intelligence to be gathered but as human experiences to be understood. He spoke of his family's history, of growing up between two worlds, of the pain of internment and the complicated relief of being released. He spoke of America with a love that was tempered by disappointment, like a child who had discovered their parents' flaws but still yearned for approval. Do you think we can ever go back? Takeshi asked one day. They were sitting outside the library, watching the sun set behind the mountains. To Japan, I think that depends on what kind of Japan exists after this, Nakano said. The country you left. Does it still exist? Can it exist? And if it can't, if everything has changed, then what does going back even mean? The question haunted Takeshi. He thought about Hiroshima before the war, the castle, the rivers, the streetcars, the daily rhythms of ordinary life. He thought about his job at the postal service, sorting mail and stamps, the mundane satisfaction of order and routine. He thought about Funday mornings with Yuki, shopping at the market for vegetables, arguing playfully over which fish looked freshest. He thought about his mother's cooking, his father's lectures, his younger sister's piano practice echoing through their small house. All of that was gone now, even if the physical places remained, and he wasn't certain they did. The world that had contained them had been destroyed. The certainties they'd lived by had proved to be lies. The leaders they'd trusted had led them into catastrophe. The glory they'd been promised had turned to ash. In the evenings, after dinner, some of the prisoners gathered to play traditional games, go, shogi, card games they'd learned as children. Takeshi joined occasionally, though he was never very good. What he appreciated was the sound of Japanese conversation, the familiar rhythms and patterns, the jokes and stories that connected them to a shared culture, even as that culture seemed to be dying in the world outside these fences. Hiro had found work in the camp's kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing dishes alongside a crew of younger prisoners. He came back to the barracks each evening smelling of onions and soap. His hands wrinkled from the water, and he seemed somehow lighter than he had on the ship. The work gave him purpose, or at least the illusion of it. The cook is Italian, Hiro reported one night, sitting on his bunk with his legs dangling over the side. His name is Angelo. He's been teaching me English words. Today I learned mushroom and garlic and stir until golden brown. Why is an Italian man teaching you English? Someone asked. He's American, but his parents came from Italy. He says in America, everyone is from somewhere else. Except the Indians, but even they came from somewhere thousands of years ago. Hiro grinned. It's very confusing. It's America, Kenji Sato said from across the aisle. He was cleaning dirt from under his fingernails, patient and methodical. Everything here is confusing. I've been working in the gardens for 3 weeks now, and do you know what I've learned? That American soil is rich. Rich in a way our soil hasn't been for generations. They don't have to terrace every hillside or fight for every inch of arable land. They have so much space, so much water, so much of everything that they can afford to be generous. Or wasteful. I'm not sure which. Both, suggested another prisoner. a former schoolteacher named Ichiro Tanaka. They're generous because they can afford to be wasteful. And they're wasteful because they've never known true scarcity. The conversation continued, ranging over topics that would have been unthinkable to discuss openly in Japan. Critiques of military leadership, questions about the emperor's role, speculation about post-war politics. The liberation of captivity was this: the ability to speak freely, to doubt openly, to question everything they'd been taught without fear of punishment. But it was a painful liberation. Each doubt was a small betrayal. Each question was an admission that they'd been fools. Each conversation peeled away another layer of certainty, leaving them naked and vulnerable in a world that made no sense. One morning, Takeshi was summoned to the administrative office. He went with his heart pounding, convinced he'd broken some rule without knowing it, that he was about to be punished or segregated or sent to some worse fate. Instead, he found Lieutenant Morrison sitting behind a desk, and on the desk was a single envelope. "Prisoner 47283, Morrison said through the translator who had been called in. "You have mail." Mail. The word didn't register at first. Takeshi stared at the envelope, at the careful handwriting that he would recognize anywhere. Yuki. His wife had written to him. She knew he was alive. She had found him across the ocean, across the war, across the impossible distance between who he had been and who he had become. His hands shook as he took the envelope. Morrison nodded toward the door. "You can read it in the library. Take your time." Takeshi walked to the library in a daze. He found a corner table where the light was good and opened the envelope with a care that bordered on reverence. The letter was 3 pages long, written on thin paper in ink that had smudged in places, perhaps from tears, perhaps from the journey across the Pacific. He read slowly, absorbing every word. "My dearest Takeshi, I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if you are alive to receive it, but I write it anyway, because I must believe you are somewhere in this world, breathing the same air, watching the same moon. The war is over. You may already know this." The emperor spoke on the radio. Such a strange thing to hear his voice, to learn that he is human after all. He said we must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. We are trying. Hiroshima is gone. I am sorry to tell you this in a letter, but you must know. The Americans dropped a new kind of bomb. One bomb, Takeshi. One bomb destroyed everything. Your parents' house, our house, the post office where you worked, the castle, the rivers, everything is ash. Your mother and father were killed instantly. Your sister was in Osaka, so she survived. She is living with my family now in Okinawa. I do not tell you this to cause you pain. I tell you because you have a right to know, and because even painful truth is better than comfortable lies. We have had too many lies. I am working in a factory now, making cloth. The pay is poor, but it is something. Food is scarce. We are all very thin. But we survive. We endure. We hope. If you are alive, if you are reading this, please know that I do not blame you for surrendering. I do not blame you for surviving. I am grateful, so grateful, that you chose life. Too many chose death or had death chosen for them. The world needs people who are willing to rebuild, not just people who are willing to die. Come home when you can. I will wait. I have always been waiting. Your wife, Yuki. Takeshi read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put his head down on the table and wept. He wept for his parents, who he would never see again. He wept for Hiroshima, the city of his birth, now a name synonymous with destruction. He wept for the years lost, for the innocence destroyed, for the future that had been stolen. But underneath the grief was something else, something that felt almost like hope. Yuki still loved him. She was waiting for him. She had given him permission to be alive. When he finally raised his head, he found Daniel Nakano sitting across from him, not speaking, just present. The man pushed a handkerchief across the table. Takeshi took it, wiped his face, and tried to find words. "My home is gone," he said finally. "I know," Nakano replied. "Mine too. But maybe we can build new ones. Maybe that's what comes next." Takeshi looked at him through eyes that still burned with tears. How How do you build a home in the ashes? The same way you build anything. One stone at a time. One day at a time. With people who matter. Nakano stood up. Come on. Let's go outside. The sun is shining, and the air is clear. That's something. That's a start. They walked out of the library together into the California afternoon. Around them, life continued in its strange new patterns. Men playing basketball. Men tending gardens. Men sitting in groups, talking quietly, learning to be prisoners, learning to be survivors, learning to be something they had no words for yet. Takeshi looked up at the sky, at the clouds moving slowly eastward, and thought about Yuki in Okinawa, working in her factory, eating her meager meals, surviving. He thought about his sister, alive when she should have been dead, living in a world that made no sense. He thought about all the ways in which life insisted on continuing despite every reason to stop. And he thought, tomorrow I will write her back. Tomorrow I will tell her I am alive. Tomorrow I will begin to imagine a future that doesn't include dying with honor. Tomorrow. It was the smallest word, the most revolutionary concept, the beginning of everything. The idea had never occurred to Takeshi before, that Americans might be as uncertain, as lost in their own way, as the prisoners they guarded. But as winter deepened into spring, he began to see it everywhere. In the way Lieutenant Morrison's hands shook slightly when he had to discipline a prisoner. In the nervous jokes the young guards made to fill uncomfortable silences. In Daniel Nakano's endless questions about Japanese culture. As if understanding the enemy might help him understand himself. By March, Takeshi's English had improved enough to have simple conversations without a translator. He volunteered for the camp library, organizing books and helping other prisoners find reading material. It gave him purpose, and more importantly, it gave him access to American newspapers that arrived weekly, heavily censored but still revealing. He read about the occupation of Japan, about General MacArthur's reforms, about food shortages and the black market, about war crimes trials beginning in Tokyo. Each article was a window into a country he no longer recognized, a homeland that was being rebuilt by the very enemy that had destroyed it. Do you think they hate us? Hiro asked one evening as they sat outside the barracks, watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and purple. The Americans, I mean, after everything we did, Pearl Harbor, the death marches, the kamikaze attacks. Do you think they can ever forgive us? Takeshi thought about Lieutenant Morrison sharing the story of his father's journals, about the Italian-American cook teaching Hiro English, about the guards who had learned to say good morning in Japanese, who sometimes joined in their baseball games during recreation time. I think, he said slowly, that Americans don't think the way we do. They separate the government from the people, the military from the civilians. They can hate what Japan did without hating every Japanese person. It's strange to us, but maybe it's why they can be generous even in victory. In April, new prisoners arrived from the Philippines, men who had been captured in the final desperate months of fighting. They brought fresh news, fresh anger, fresh shame. They spoke of soldiers who had fought to the death rather than surrender, of officers who had committed suicide rather than face capture, of a homeland in ruins where people were starving in the streets. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. One of the new arrivals, a captain named Yoshida, refused to work, refused to learn English, refused to accept the reality of defeat. He spent his days sitting rigid on his bunk, staring at nothing, trapped in a world that no longer existed. Takeshi recognized that man. He had been that man on the ship crossing the Pacific. But somehow, in the months since, he had changed. Yoshida-san, Takeshi said to him one afternoon, you should come to the English class. It helps pass the time. I will never speak the enemy's language, Yoshida replied coldly. I am still a soldier of the emperor. I refuse to collaborate. We're not collaborating, Takeshi said gently. We're surviving. There's a difference. Is there? Yoshida's eyes were hard. You've surrendered twice, once on the battlefield, and now here in your heart. You've become their pet, their success story. Look at you, organizing their books, speaking their language, accepting their charity. Where is your honor? The words stung because there was truth in them. But Takeshi had learned something in his months of captivity. Honor without wisdom was just another word for suicide. My honor, he said quietly, is in keeping my promise to my wife, to survive, to return home, to help rebuild what was destroyed. You can sit here clinging to the past if you want, Yoshida-san. But the past is dead. The future is all we have left. In June, word came that prisoners would begin being repatriated. Not immediately, the logistics were complex, the screening process extensive. But eventually, they would go home. The announcement sent ripples of complicated emotion through the camp. Joy at the prospect of freedom, fear of what they would find, uncertainty about how they would be received. Takeshi wrote to Yuki immediately, My dearest wife, they say we will be allowed to return home soon. Perhaps in autumn, perhaps later. But I will come back to you. I am not the man who left. Cannot be. That man is gone, burned away like Hiroshima itself. But I am someone new. Someone who has learned that survival is not shameful, that questioning is not weakness, that the world is larger and stranger and more complicated than we were ever taught. I have seen the face of the enemy, and it is not what we were told. They are not demons. They are people, flawed, uncertain, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, but people nonetheless. And if they are people, then perhaps we can learn to be people again too. Wait for me a little longer. I am coming home. Not to the home we knew, that is impossible. But to whatever home we can build together in the ashes. Your husband, Takeshi. As he sealed the envelope, Takeshi looked around the camp. At Hiro laughing with the Italian cook, at Kenji tending his garden, at the other prisoners playing baseball in the dusty yard, at the mountains standing eternal in the distance. This place had been his prison, but it had also been his teacher. He had come here a defeated soldier. He would leave as something else entirely. A survivor, a student, a man who had learned that the most unusual sight in war is not the face of the enemy, but the face you see in the mirror when everything you believed has been stripped away. The war was over. The real work of peace, of rebuilding, of understanding, of becoming human again was just beginning.